Very happy to have you joining us today. My name is Brad Bell. I'm a professor of HR Studies in the ILR School here at Cornell, and I also serve as the academic director of CAHRS. Very happy to be joined today by my colleague Rebecca Kehoe, who's an associate professor here in the HR Studies department. Thanks for joining us, Becca. So over the past several years, Becca's been doing a lot of research on focus around this idea of star performers, really trying to understand, number one, what constitutes a star performer, what opportunities and challenges do star performers present to organizations, and how can companies best manage star performers. So we thought this would be a really great opportunity to talk to Becca, learn what her research has been showing, and to share some of those insights with all of you today within CAHRS. To just kind of give you an idea of what we're going to be doing over the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to start out by asking Becca a few questions to dive into some of the insights that have come out of her work. During the discussion, I really encourage you to please submit your questions. We'll be maybe fielding some of those as we go along, but we'll certainly be leaving plenty of time at the end of today's session to field your questions. So please do submit those as they come to mind. So Becca, just maybe starting off at the kind of foundation here, what are star performers? And I guess a kind of related question is, do we tend to see stars across kind of every organization, every type of industry?
So the short answer is that stars are exceptional performers. They're disproportionately productive relative to other employees. They're really the best of your best employees. We've researched dating back to the 1920s, showing that the top 5% of chemists were responsible for 50% of the scientific publications in the field. So clear sort of performance discrepancies that separate that sort of the cream of the crop from the rest of the employees or the scientists in the field. Since then, in more recent work, we've found that this sort of performance discrepancy, this existence of stars, is really robust across industries, across work settings. So we see stars in every field of science. Certainly, we're all familiar with stars in sports. We see stars in more traditional work settings as well. So we see stars, salespeople, stars in product development. So while I wouldn't say that every organization has a star, I think it's fair to say that we see evidence that stars exist somewhere in most industries. Clearly, the way that these different stars across settings create value is going to vary. So you can imagine the skills that a star salesperson who's cultivating relationships with clients is going to vary a lot from the star scientist who's developing, new drugs. So what holds stars together, what's common across stars, is their exceptional skill, their exceptional expertise, the disproportionate value they're creating for their organizations. What often goes along with that is broad positive visibility, right? So they're performing really well and it attracts attention. So it attracts attention within their organization, but also within the industry. And this is good for organizations. You want attention from clients, from other potential talent. Obviously, it also draws attention from other prospective employers, so it makes stars, attractive candidates to other organizations as well, which is sort of the flip side of that.
So is there, again, going back to the definition of stars, is there any agreement that stars represent the top kind of 5% of employees, the top 1%, or is it kind of variable across kind of different organizations and different settings?
So this is a good question. I think it's across different organizations and different settings. And then from a scholarly standpoint, the way that different people study stars, so it's actually been more recently that we've sort of accepted that we need to acknowledge that in different contexts, people create value in different ways. So in some cases, it may be, you're a star salesperson and you're an individual contributor, and that's how you're creating exceptional value. So we're going to look at your sales and sort of where that threshold is that makes you a star. That may be up to the industry. It may be up to the organization. In other contexts that are more interdependent, we may need to think about team outcomes. We may need to think about sort of more complex metrics of performance that make it a little more difficult to say, okay, this is the exact cutoff, and this is the exact way we're gonna define stars. I think for organizations, what's practically useful is to think about who's creating extraordinary value. And even, I gave examples before of these different industries, and I said, salesmen versus scientists. Even within an organization, you can have employees in different roles, star employees in different roles, who are drawing on very different skill sets and creating value in very different ways.
Mm-hmm. So there's obviously been growing interest in stars. I mean, certainly in academic literature, we've seen a lot more attention, articles looking at this, your work and others. Even in popular press, we're seeing articles talking about A players and B players and other things. Why do you think stars have attracted so much attention, and what kind of attracted you to this area of study?
I think it's so interesting because by definition, stars are rare. Right, they're an incredibly small portion of any talent pool. And I think they attract so much attention because while they're so rare, they have so much influence. They have such big influence. So you've got these individuals who are incredibly productive on their own, but then they also have the potential, in some cases because of that productivity, to have influence on their peers, big influences on their organizations. And these influences can be positive or negative, right? So I think just about every employee at one time or another has worked with a star. I think most managers at some point have managed a star. And these experiences tend to be very positive or very negative. And so you hear very polarized opinions on stars because of it's not just interacting with one other average person. It's somebody who has so much influence on the work group, on the team.
Mm-hmm. So how do these, what do these good and bad experiences, look like? And, I guess overall, if you kind of look across the research, does it suggest that, stars are good for organizations should be trying to cultivate, stars, or maybe should be a little bit more cautious in terms of, how they try to nurture stars within an organization?
I think both of those are true. Okay. I think one way to think about it is that because of this influence, everything has the potential to be magnified with stars. So on the positive side, you have stars who are these sort of resident experts that have a good deal of visibility. So they have the potential to create value by sharing knowledge, by being role models and mentors for their peers, and attracting visibility to the work that their team's doing, which is great. And at the same time, on the negative side, we see a pattern, an unfortunate pattern, that actually comes from these positive influences where organizations tend to become increasingly dependent on stars over time, and in some cases over-dependent. So we see a situation where organizations, invest in recruiting or developing a star, and then they invest huge sums of resources to support the star's work, which in itself is rational, right? Stars are proven performers, so you're likely to get a good return on investment. The problem is when this investment comes at the expense of the organization's other employees, their other projects, their other capabilities. So essentially what you see then is other employees sort of being brought over to support the work of the star, who then begin to feel like they're losing opportunities to choose the work that they're involved with, to develop their own skill sets. They start to feel undervalued. We lose capabilities within the organization in other areas because everything's being diverted to the star. So this is actually really risky for organizations. So as we increase investment in the STARS projects and divert resources and attention and rewards away from other capabilities, other projects, other employees, we essentially run the risk of this overdependence. Now, this gets back to when I said stars have the potential to have positive and negative effects on their employees. Of course, it's not a star's fault if they're getting all the resources and other employees are resentful. But what can also happen is because the star becomes so influential, because they're sort of beginning to control all the work that's being done in the organization, sometimes they get undue influence and undue power. So you have managers who then don't really know what to do if they see that a star is mistreating other employees or cutting corners or not following rules, because they're now so dependent on the star they can't afford to lose the star, and at the same time that's not really the example you want to set for other employees.
So it's, to this idea of how people react to working with stars, is there any work that kind of looks at the types of people that maybe experience higher levels of resentment or work better with stars? I mean, from kind of as we think about the other people that have to navigate these environments as coworkers, is there any kind of evidence on who fits well into that and maybe who doesn't?
So from the perspective of the people working with stars, people who can sort of carry their own, who have their own sort of their own record of performance, even if they're not a star. So those strong performers who maybe can sort of attract resources and attract support for their work, even if most of the resources are being diverted to the star, they tend to fare better. And then on the flip side of that, we see that there are some characteristics of the sort of relationship between the star and other employees that are important. So when stars have expertise that is sort of very similar to other employees, that can be detrimental because stars are then more likely to engage in what we call turf protection, where they're even more likely to sort of hog resources and make sure that they have the highest status in the group because they feel like they're at more threat or greater risk of losing that differential than if others have lots of different areas of expertise. We can all have status, right? We can all make decisions because we're not necessarily directly competing with each other.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, given these pros and cons, I mean, what would you recommend to organizations in terms of how to get the most, from their stars while also maybe mitigating some of these risks that you've been talking about?
So I think the simple answer is balance. Of course, it's not that simple. So I think the most important but the trickiest thing for organizations is to yes, invest in supporting the star's work. As I said before, that's a good investment, right? You hired the star, you developed the star because they have these proven performance records, but not doing that at the expense of your other employees and the organization's other capabilities. You don't want to be in the situation where you've essentially hollowed out the rest of the organization just to support the star. That's when you become really vulnerable to a star's undue influence, or if the star leaves, things falling apart. So in terms of specific tips, I would say while investing in the star's work, in the star's projects, continuing to invest in other employees, right? And this actually does two things. So first, it makes the organization less dependent on the star today, right? So we've got other employees who are capable, who are competent, and so we're not all just going to bow to whatever the star wants. The second thing that it does is, if and when the star does leave, it makes the organization more resilient. The star didn't take everything with them because the organization has continued to maintain investment in other capabilities and in other talent. So it creates an internal talent pipeline that makes the organization better able to bounce back. It's still going to hurt when a star leaves, but they can bounce back a little bit easier. Another thing that I would say is, this is more in terms of managing the star themselves, creating structures and reward systems that align with knowledge sharing and positive teamwork. So this might seem intuitive, but sometimes it's easy to think, well, we just need to sort of let the star do what the star wants to do because, they know how to perform well. But if from the beginning we can set an expectation that sharing knowledge, that helping others to perform is part of the job, then it's more likely that stars will feel that those behaviors are not taking away from their job. This is part of the expectation of me being a good member of this organization. So it's creating that structure in advance and maybe tying incentives to knowledge sharing, to mentoring, to whatever kind of role modeling behaviors we're looking for at the outset to sort of set that structure for the star. And finally, this is to kind of balance these other points. I'm kind of making stars seem like, be careful. Stars have a dark side. They're bad. Stars aren't islands, so they do need support. So none of this is to say don't invest resources in stars, and none of it's to say don't invest more resources in stars than you're investing in the average employee, right? These are good returns on investment. So it's recognizing that it really is all about balance.
So just a reminder, there's a note coming in about audio problems. We'll There'll be no questions, but we'll be working to fix that. But as we do, just a reminder, you can submit questions. We'll answer those at the end. Talking about this idea, I mean, often when we talk about talent, particularly star talent, I think there's often this question of, should as an organization we be kind of trying to develop this talent internally through kind of strong succession and development programs, or should we be kind of going out in the market and really recruiting this type of talent in? So how do you think about that build and buy decision, particularly within the context of stars? Is it the same type of discussion, or does it differ somehow?
So I think I'll go back to a point I made before, that with stars, everything has the potential to be magnified, right? So all of the considerations we make, we have to think about them more carefully and think about how to manage them a little bit more closely in the context of stars. So one interesting finding that we see is that when stars change organizations, they see a significant drop in their performance. And we actually see this across all employees, and it makes sense, right? Your performance to some extent is embedded in the organization you're working in. The colleagues that you're working with help to support that. And so when you change, you move to a new employer, you don't know anyone, you don't know how things work, it takes you a little time to come up to speed. The difference with stars is that stars' performance is so visible, right? So organizations hire stars with an expectation of, they know what they're going to get. They know they're going to get this incredible value. And so that drop in performance is a little bit or a lot more of a letdown than with the sort of typical employee. And stars do bounce back, but that is something to be aware of, particularly if you've got some time-sensitive projects, if you are going to the external market. So a related point is I would emphasize the importance of fit. So again, this applies to all employees. You want to bring in employees or develop employees that are a really good fit for the values of your organization, the culture of the organization, the manager they're going to be working for, which can be more challenging when you're hiring externally, right? When you develop internally, you invest in the people who you know fit. They're the ones who stick around. Externally, you don't necessarily know if it's going to be a good fit. And because stars have the potential to have so much influence, they have the potential to either kind of raise up or just wreak havoc on the work environment and on any team they're working in. And so evaluating that fit is incredibly important in the context of bringing a star in. So those 2 points sort of point to, we should be developing internally. And while that can be great for predictability, there's a reality that there's a smaller talent pool within the organization than there is externally. So sometimes investing internally is not an option. Another point is sometimes the people you're investing in who you know are a good fit don't necessarily have the capacity to become superstars. So the investment might not pan out. The other possibility is that they could leave, right? Another organization could poach them. And so that's sort of something we need to be prepared for. And so at the risk of repeating myself again, it comes down to balance. I think it comes down to, you definitely want to continue to invest in that strong internal pipeline. At the same time, you're probably, if you're looking for stars, you're probably going to at some point have to turn to the external market. And in doing so, that's where those considerations come in. Be prepared for a drop in performance. Be prepared for to need to engage in a really careful assessment of fit. Not just an assessment of, does it seem like this person fits the culture? Maybe even bring in the team they're going to work with. Certainly bring in the manager they're going to be working with and see if there's a fit there.
That makes a lot of sense. And I mean, your discussion around building stars internally, goes back to a question I had when you were talking about the definition of stars, which is, how good are companies at recognizing or identifying stars, right? Particularly in the formative years, and I think we know that it's somewhat of a imperfect process, right? And so
exactly.
The idea of identifying these people early on who are going to become stars and giving them the right development is always going to be somewhat of a hit or miss proposition.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so we have some questions, so we'll start fielding some of those. So, one question here is around, what are some of the mistakes that you see kind of organizations making most often, and what maybe can they do differently?
So I think one mistake is sort of flagging someone as a star or as a high potential, and putting them into a leadership track. So often we assume, well, stars create this exceptional value, and of course we want them to lead a function. We want them to lead a team of employees. That can be a mistake. Some stars are good leaders, but some aren't. Many aren't. Some stars don't want to be leaders. And in many cases, what makes a star is their ability to create value as an individual contributor, not because they're so great at managing people. And so I think that's a mistake that too many organizations make. I think another mistake is managing stars too much about compensation. So of course stars want to be rewarded and recognized for their work, for their contributions, but money isn't always the answer. So we know that one of the reasons stars are so incredibly productive is because they're really intrinsically motivated. So if organizations can play to that a little bit more, stars are likely to appreciate benefits like stretch assignments, access to key clients or interesting projects, or resources to work on something that might not really be in the organization's core area, but that the star is really passionate about. So in addition to playing to sort of the intrinsic motivation and interest of the star, I think the other sort of benefit of that is that it doesn't create such a huge discrepancy in the monetary rewards that other employees are seeing that the star is getting that they're not, and so is likely to help to alleviate some of the resentment that you might otherwise see.
Mm-hmm. So I imagine on that last point that there is some industry context there, right? I imagine if you're Wall Street and you're a star trader, part of your visibility and recognition is the compensation that you receive, where in other industries where maybe that's not as much the norm, companies can focus on some of those intrinsic rewards to a greater extent. That
is true. So one approach that some organizations take, even on Wall Street, is, although it's again going to be more rare there than in other contexts, is tying those rewards not only to the outcome or to the individual performance, but also to how you achieve it. So how are you treating the employees around you? How are you making that target? And so it's not perfect. It's not kind of leveraging all these other things I'm suggesting, but it's something that can help to address the other issues that we're talking about.
Good. So another question is around, you talked about the fact, particularly when they first come in, they're going to experience this dip in performance. You might see these other times where maybe they plateau, or even their performance declines for one reason or another. How can organizations manage those performance issues when they come up? So I think the first thing is to not jump to any conclusions, not make assumptions about what's causing this. So certainly if a star has just come into the organization, some of it's going to be they need some time to come up to speed, maybe helping them to find the resources and the support they need. But if the star's been around a while and you start to see that plateau or that dip, maybe asking. So we find that there are a few key things that can lead to that kind of plateau or that decline. So one is burnout, which strikes some as surprising because we think, well, stars are intrinsically motivated. They're these exceptional contributors. That can actually be what leads to their burnout, particularly when we see that pattern of over-dependence or increasing dependence on the star come into play. In addition to the exhaustion that stars might start to feel just from the work, from the organization's dependence on them, they can also experience a great deal of stress when they start to feel like the team or the organization's success or even survival is all on their shoulders. And so it could be a matter of burnout, and in that case, it's probably taking some of the weight off of the star's shoulders. Another issue is motivation. This comes back to the making it all about compensation. While in some cases stars want to be recognized and rewarded through compensation, that's not necessarily going to solve all their motivation problems if you have them in a role doing work that they're not passionate about,
one of the things that makes stars so successful is that they're passionate and intrinsically motivated. And so if you take them out of a context that where they're feeling that, that's likely to be problematic.
Yeah, great. So I think we have time maybe for one more question. So you talked a little bit about one of maybe the dark side of stars is that they can create this toxic environment or maybe mistreat, coworkers, or organizations can just create systems that lead to that type of mistreatment. So how can organizations, again, maybe mitigate against some of those risks in terms of, making sure that there's still a collaborative environment, there's a good team environment, surrounding the stars?
So there's everything about balancing dependence, balancing investments that I said before. I would also say creating an expectation that any kind of mistreatment of other employees, whether you're a star or not, just won't be tolerated. So I think ideally, right, we have managers who recognize these issues right away and they nip it in the bud. They let the star know that's not acceptable behavior and it won't be tolerated. I think the reality is that stars have this immense influence and other employees may be hesitant to speak up if they're being mistreated by a star. And even when they do speak up, managers may be in the situation where they're afraid that they can't afford to lose the star, and so they don't exactly know how to respond. They don't know what the best course of action is. And so I think this really does come down to the manager. It's really taking a stand that at whatever point I become aware of this behavior, whether it's ideally at the beginning or even if it's later and you've got this toxic work environment, being really clear in your messaging to the star that this won't be tolerated. Even if this has gone sort of under the radar up to this point, this is not something we'll continue to tolerate. And being consistent with that message, so you can't necessarily expect if a star's been acting like this for years that all of a sudden you talk to them once and they're going to clean up their act, right? Mm-hmm. So kind of being consistent, if it happens again, sending the same message every time. And if this continues to be repeated behavior and the star doesn't seem to be changing the way they're treating people, that it may be time to cut ties with the star. So saving or protecting the employment of, or the ego of one star is never going to be worth, alienating or compromising the well-being of the rest of the organization or even a few other employees.
Mm-hmm. So maybe just a quick follow-up to that is, do you find with stars that there's particular types of behaviors that they engage in that kind of cross this line? Because I would imagine in some cases, if it's things that are clearly a violation of organizational policies like sexual harassment, that's maybe more clear cut to deal with. But there might just be the stars particularly demanding of the people that they work around, or maybe they're just kind of a little bit eccentric in the way they work, right? Because they are somewhat unique or different. So I imagine that there's kind of different gradations of what this mistreatment or poor collaboration might look like.
There absolutely is, and actually I think that's a problem because there's a huge one problem is that there's a huge gray area. So you do see that they're maybe overly demanding. In other cases, you see that stars are actually verbally abusive to employees who they think aren't meeting their expectations. Mm-hmm. This is particularly true if among employees who are in a position supporting the star or who are on the team of the star, where the star, whether they're in a position of formal authority or not, are sort of taking on this leadership role in the sense that they feel they have the authority to say whatever they want in response to what they think is a lack of performance or performance that's up to par by their peers or the people who are supporting them, which obviously is not leadership at all, but sometimes they kind of take that view.
Yeah. Well, I think we're almost out of time. Fascinating work, and thanks for sharing all your insights, and I think definitely a lot of good takeaways for our companies to draw from today's discussion. Before we wrap up, just want to highlight some upcoming events. CAHRS is building out its spring schedule, so we have a number of other webcasts scheduled for both March and April, and we'll have more coming in May and June as well. We also have some upcoming working groups focused on digital transformation, HR transformation more broadly, as well as an international meeting planned for Singapore in May. So please go to our website to check up and to keep abreast of our upcoming events. Thanks again to Becca for joining us, and hope to see you at a future CAHRS event. Thanks for joining us.